I am so happy to be here today with Ryan Lewis, a software developer. And Ryan and I have been talking offline quite a bit about different ideas, and I value his perspective on things. And we both listened to Jordan Peterson's conversation or lecture, I guess, at Ephesus, the Logos at Ephesus. And we were both struck by a number of things that he said. So Ryan is going to sort of kick this off talking about how the Logos at Ephesus relates to software development. And I'm really interested to hear what he has to say.
Cool. Thanks, Karen. Yeah, I'm not an expert in anything in the world by any means. So
Aren't we glad?
yeah. So this will just be me rambling, and I'm just another peanut in the peanut gallery. So, for whatever this is or isn't worth.
Well, that's the lovely thing about being a very small little corner.
Right. Yeah, so I guess I don't know. I stumbled across Peterson back in like 2016 or something, and I'm not even sure I could tell you exactly why I was interested in him. I gravitated to him. I gravitated to the Maps of Meaning lectures and just saw something there that was interesting. And over the years I've started to kind of piece it together. And I think this Logos at Ephesus thing really helped because yeah, I think it relates to a lot of my thoughts about just software. I've been writing code since I was like 7 years old, almost every day since then. I just became obsessed with it. And it's an interesting field to me because I think people often perceive it as it is logic and math heavy, obviously, but I think people perceive it in this very strict, structured way. And they think of it as purely a science, whereas I've really come to think of it more as an art. And there is kind of a conversation in the industry about this, like whether it's more like a science or an art. And I've argued with my coworkers about this. It's a fun thing to kind of banter back and forth because you've got some really staunch like materialists who are like, no, this is a science and I want to be called a computer scientist and all this stuff. And then you've got some more kind of touchy-feely, free-flowy people like me who are like, no, it's about all these intuitions and stuff. And so like when Peterson talks about I don't know how we're not necessarily directly perceiving just pure matter. We're really perceiving our own kind of abstractions on top of that, and we're perceiving possibilities and all this kind of stuff. I really feel that when I'm doing software stuff because it's like, like on this monitor here, I have one of my systems I work on, and it's just millions of lines of code. It's massive. It's 20 something years old. It's there's just a lot going on, and it's like I can't perceive all the lines of code. Obviously, I don't even have all that in my brain. I haven't even seen all of it, right? What I really have in my brain is a bunch of abstractions at different levels, and so like I conceive of the system as parts of a system, right? And those are like abstractions of stuff. And so I might think of the login system or whatever, which really that's backed by a whole bunch of code, and that interacts with other parts of the system that are doing different things. And like when developers are getting together talking about this stuff, we're not usually talking about the literal like actual lines of code. We're usually talking about our abstractions, and so we're engaging with each other at the level of this thing that's higher up. And then when you really get down to it, it's like, okay, what then is the system? Is it the code? Because even a line of this code is kind of an abstraction, because that's like commands in a language down to a lower language, and that feeds down to a lower language, and eventually you get down to the hardware executing stuff on these bits, and a bit is a whatever, an electrical signal, and that goes down, and it's like turtles all the way down, right? Because we don't even know what's at the bottom of that, and it's naive for us to think that it's just kind of fundamental reality down there somewhere. And so I don't know, this is just the kind of stuff that pops in my head when I listen to Peterson, because I just live in the world of software, and I don't know. Does that make any sense?
Oh, absolutely. But I wonder, you said turtles all the way down. It seems to me it's more like turtles all the way up, because
Yeah,
whatever it is that's down there, it's the thing above that that's managing it, and then the thing above that that's managing that, and it goes all the way up to where the instruction set or the rule set is coming from these higher abstraction levels,
right.
right?
And it's interesting to sit in different kinds of meetings because, like, we'll you might have a meeting where you're actually looking at lines of code and people are arguing about it. But then you might have a meeting where you're at another level of abstraction and you're talking about parts of the system, and you might go all the way up and talk about the whole architecture as a whole, or the architecture of this system as it relates to other systems. And it's like everyone's got to be on the same page about which level of abstraction they're talking about for it to make any sense. And what I find, I guess, good developers are the ones that seem like they're best at kind of reading the room and knowing what level of abstraction to talk about. You get these really math and logic-y people that get really fixated on things, and they tend to talk too far down, and then they're trying to engage with people that are more thinking about the system up here, especially people that aren't programmers. They can't look at the code, they can't understand the code, but they can understand all the higher level abstractions, right? And so that's what they're talking about. But if the developer is talking down here, then it just doesn't match and it's not congruent, right? And
That seems to me
you
that
know,
that's sort of that paradigm of accuracy and expression, that you can go too far in one direction or the other. So if the guys that get fixated on the little niggly stuff down at the bottom, or towards the bottom, they're focusing so much on accuracy that they're losing the big picture of the expressive nature of what this thing is meant to do as a whole, right?
yes,
And then the people that are not technical, they tend to think more in that expressive world, and they can fly off too far into the stratosphere without
right,
getting anywhere, right? So you
yeah,
need the people in the middle that can kind of hold things together.
yeah. And that's a lot of what we deal with. Like I think I've been kind of surprised as I've been in the software industry that so much of it is really it's people work more so than thing work, if that makes any sense. Like I really thought I would be spending a lot of my time writing code, and I do, but really I spend a lot of my time working with, like, on the phone with people as we talk about the abstractions that exist in our heads, and we need to kind of coordinate with each other. Like if I'm going to go change the whole architecture of some part of the system, I'm working on my little mental model, which is going to feed down into the actual code eventually, and then I've got to communicate that to everyone else so they can update their mental models. And you used the word earlier, like what the system is meant to be. And I think that in some senses is one of the more fascinating things to me about all this, because it's like, where does the system live? Like obviously in
Mm.
a plain flat material sense, the system lives in the hardware, right? It's code that has flipped some bits on some chips somewhere, and that gets executed. And like, yeah, that is the system, sort of. But like when there's a bug in it, we tend to think of it as what's in the hardware is not operating according to what the system ought to be. And so we kind of have this higher level conception of the system, which we really think of as the real system, right? And so that you could think of it as the meaning and the matter, right? And so it's like the program, actually, literally, whatever exists on the hardware, but in a kind of more fundamental sense, the program exists in the minds of all the people designing it, right? And we even in the industry, we talk about it this way in kind of in our slang. We'll say things like, oh, it feels like that part of the system wants to be doing this. We kind of impose this sort of intentionality on it, or this sort of life to it. And what we're meaning by that is that there's this almost like form that the system is trying to conform to, right? And because it's like you can find parts of the system that just don't feel quite congruent, right? And they're not fitting together properly. And we even have we have phrases for this, like a smell. You know, like I open the fridge and I smell something bad. It's like I might not be aware of where that's coming from. I'm sensing something, and then I have to find out what that is. You know, but the same thing happens when I'm looking at code. It's a really weird feeling, honestly, that's hard to describe to people, but it's like I can look at a whole part of a system or code or bugs or whatever, and I just have kind of this sense that like, something's off here. Something smells bad. And well, that's actually what we call it, code smell. Right. And it's like something just feels off, and you kind of just you don't do a bunch of logic and math to find the bug. You actually kind of just sit with it for a while. I mean, almost like literally, you kind of just sit here and kind of feel it, and just kind of let you let feelings and intuitions bubble to the surface, and eventually you have a moment of insight where you're like, oh wait, maybe it's over there, and you do this sort of tree thing. And good developers are the ones who are really really good at that process, because like when a bug happens, it could be coming from any part of this system, any millions of the lines of code, right? And you know, if especially with like less experienced developers, you know, you'll get on a phone call with them and you're trying to solve a problem, and they just start throwing everything that comes in their mind at you. They're like, maybe it's this, maybe it's this, maybe it's this. And I find that especially the more experienced I get, the more I get better at just naturally filtering out like 98% of what they're saying. And I'm not doing that based on logic or explicit knowledge. You know, I'm doing it based on just feeling, just gut feelings. It's like I hear the words and they just kind of bounce off because I'm naturally like, I don't know, it's not that. And I couldn't tell you why, you know. And maybe, you know, if you asked me why, maybe I could say, well, you know, because of this and this and this. But like that all just happened somehow, you know. And then a lot of developers will have these crazy experiences where we'll actually dream solutions to problems. You know, it's the same kind of thing as I think you've talked about with scientists, where it's like, you know, we like to think that our scientific and, you know, our whatever, that kind of knowledge happens through this logic and through this explicit, like I have my axioms and I work out the thing and boom, I come to the thing. It's like that's not how it works at all. And that's not how it really works in software either, which
Mhm.
is why I'm always arguing to my coworkers. This really, I experience this more as an art. You know, if I was writing a novel, you know, I imagine I'd be kind of sitting with the characters and just kind of pondering and feeling what would they do. It wouldn't be this rote, boring math process. It would be this very flowy kind of dance. And I do the same thing with software. You know what I mean?
Mhm. Yeah, and that's fascinating. I mean, everything that you said is just resonating. Um, I'm interested that there's actually a debate within the industry that you have some people that cling more to the, oh, it's strictly scientific, it's strictly logical, and then the other side that kind of sees the necessity of the intuition
Mm-hmm.
of the imagination in the whole process. I don't see how you could possibly get away from the imagination aspect of it, because I mean, you're building something that's never existed before. So
Right.
there's no other option except imagination, you know.
Right.
Where in a sense, all that we can see is what has come before, what has already been, has gone from a wave to a particle. It's already solid, it's concrete. You know, the past is concrete, it's there. Um,
Right.
that's all we can see. All I can see are the things that have been manufactured around me that inhabit my life. Um, but if I'm going to move forward, I have to find my way through that path of possibilities. And that requires some sort of connection to a higher meaning or a higher goal or a higher aim. And if you have a responsibility to build a certain product that's going to provide facility for people in their either, you know, their computers or their phones or, you know, whatever it might be, their Wi-Fi widgets, then you've got to be looking at that path of possibilities. You've got to be using imagination. That's not all, it's certainly not the scientific process, because the scientific process, you'd be stumbling around trying this experiment and then trying that experiment and then
Hmm.
observing the results of the experiments. And you could do it that way, sure, but I think it would be a much longer process, wouldn't it?
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, yeah. And it's like my coworkers who see things in a more material or scientific way, I think like they would certainly acknowledge like, yeah, there is this process of exploration or whatever and intuition, and that all helps. But I think they just kind of see that as like, well, that's just kind of pragmatic layers that exist on top. I don't think they really see any real meaning up there. You know what I mean? It's like, I remember we read this. We do some book clubs at work just for fun, and we read this. I think it was Doug Hofstadter, Gödel, Escher, Bach,
Mm-hmm.
which is a really interesting little book. I think you would like it actually if you ever
I
read it.
I I tried listening. There's a series of his lectures online of the Gödel Escherbach where he's
Okay,
teaching it to some students at whatever high level university he's at, and it's
right.
all free. It's great, but it seemed a little bit beyond my what he was teaching them anyway. Seemed quite a bit beyond my technical expertise.
Gotcha. Okay.
So it might be easier for me to read the book because I could just flip through and find the parts that stand out to me or that resonate with
Mhm.
my
Well,
thinking.
it's a funny book because it's really quirky. It's really weird. I mean, he's like using all these like metaphors and like stories and Alice in Wonderland and stuff, and he's basically trying to argue that like consciousness is emergent. Like when you really get down to it, that's what he's trying to contend for. And I
Mhm.
think that's how a lot of my coworkers see it. And so I think if they heard me talking about all this, they would acknowledge most of what I'm saying, but I think their pushback would be something like, well, you know, that is all you're just describing the complexity of what happens, but the complexity still exists in it's just the stuff, it's just the matter, right? And I guess this is kind of like my where I connect it with what Peterson is doing, because it seems like Peterson's project is trying to tease out like what is precisely the relationship between all these things.
Mhm.
um and and so I guess I when I listen to the Logos at Ephesus and I think through how would I talk about this stuff with um some of my like materialist coworkers, like it feels very similar to the conversations we've had about like software development itself, because it's like Peterson's doing this thing where he's trying to argue that in some sense meaning is like I don't know how to put it. I'm not a philosopher, but like meaning is like more fundamental
Well, he says
than
meaning.
matter.
Well, I'm not sure if he said this outright, but what I wrote in my notes is meaning precedes matter.
Right. And
Because when we look at an object, we don't look at the object just as an object and then infer how to use it or what it would mean in our lives. When we look at the object, we immediately see it as a tool or see it as a means to something that we can use. And our body even forms itself immediately on how to pick it up because we know what we're going to do with it. So the meaning inside our heads, at least, precedes the matter. But then he goes beyond that to, I think in that lecture, he's actually going all the way back to like the, in the beginning was the word almost, getting back to that very
mhm.
fundamental point that the word precedes the cosmos basically, which is like the meaning precedes the matter. And
And so
certainly in
this is
language, computer is a language. So whatever software is, the meaning is there before the matter arrives. My husband designs Wi-Fi boxes. He has the picture of that thing in his head before he ever gets it on paper or hands it over to somebody else to tool it up and create the box. So the meaning is preceding the instantiation of that meaning into matter. It works in every other area of life. So why wouldn't it work in these very
That's
fundamental things?
very interesting. I've actually never thought about that. Because yeah, like in order for like Wi-Fi to work, you have a group of people that gets together and like Sweden or somewhere and literally sits around saying this is how it should work. And then
Mhm.
that gets distributed to all the people who are building the hardware and the software.
Yes,
And so yeah, that has to come from above.
you
So
bet.
then so then it's like, I guess really what then is like, does that go all the way up? Like, and I think that's kind of what Peterson is working on, right? It's like it seems that it must, but what does that mean? Because I think again, like that my coworkers would push back, I think, saying like, well, we experience it that way. We experience it as if it goes all the way up, but like that's just our experience. And if we weren't there to experience it, then it would just be flat matter. There is nothing at the top. The top is something we impose. And I guess this is really, I guess, why I've been thinking about this so much, because it's like I don't feel like I really have a good response to that that's compelling. Like I personally am religious. Like I believe in God in the plainest sense of that, but how I don't know how to make this connection in a way that actually, I don't know.
Well, so I have a couple of thoughts, and not to answer that question, but just thoughts that came
Sure.
up while you were talking. Um, First of all, even before we arrived on this planet, there were a lot of plants, and plants are certainly striving upwards towards some goal. I mean, that's absolutely irrefutable. If you look at the biology of plants, um, it would be interesting maybe for some of your coworkers to see some of that stuff, like everything that's going on in a tree, just the factory that a tree is, and the purposes that it has in the world. I mean,
Hmm.
it's beyond comprehension. But the other thing that came to my mind is a very simple little thought that I had written down. I was telling you before we got on that I spent 5 hours trying to go through a pile of papers in my office. And I kept running into things that I had written down. And so I make little notes for myself. And one of those little notes is, since error exists, and we know that errors exist, right? There can be mistakes, problems, errors everywhere. Then there has to be a standard somewhere that's correct. And errors must have existed since the beginning of time. I don't know. Um, Certainly, at least since the garden, errors have existed. But when you think about uh, hydrogen and helium forming stars and then elements being burnished off in the midst of these stars and everything and turning into elements, and was that all a seamless process that just all happened, or did it happen through some sort of trial and error thing? I mean, I don't know, but when you're looking at, for example, Michael Levin and his multicellular organisms as they're developing, um, there are sometimes little errors that happen in that development. Maybe like with thalidomide. I don't know if you remember the whole thalidomide thing back 50 years ago or so. There was it was some sort of a medication. I can't remember what it was for. Maybe it was for anxiety or something. And they were prescribing it to just about everybody. And they thought it was safe for pregnant women, but it wasn't.
Mhm.
And babies were born with no legs or with no arms or with just little hands sticking out of their shoulders. Um, it was really horrible. But those errors happened because the cells weren't following their normal path towards the thing that they're striving towards, the goal of this perfect development. So, one of the things Michael Levin always asks is, how do the cells know when they're building an arm? How do they know where to stop so that both arms end up the same length? I mean, those things are very mysterious, even to the people who work intimately with that stuff day in and day out.
Mm.
So, but the other thought that came to my mind is one of the books I was reading a couple of years ago and I took quite a few notes on, which I'd like to go back to, is a book by Dorothy Sayers. I don't know if you know who she is. She was a writer. She wrote mystery novels, and she also wrote books of philosophy back in the
Interesting.
mid 20th century, maybe. Um, Beautiful mind. And she wrote a book called The Mind of the Maker, where she's looking at art and the creation of art. And she came up with this idea that she calls the Trinity of creativity. So the Trinity of creativity consists of the creative idea, the creative energy, and the creative power. So the idea, the energy, and the power. So I was trying to think how that breaks down in various categories. And so the idea would be with art, the idea would be art as conceived before you've begun the project, right? Or with a book, it would be the book as conceived in your mind, as thought about before you start the writing process. Then the creative energy would be the art as it is produced, the process and the result of producing the art, or the process and the result of the writing of the book. But then the power is the meaning of the work, or it is the art as it is being viewed by somebody and their relationship with the work and the power and the meaning that they find in the work. Or a book as when it's being read, the interaction of the reader and the book and the relationship that the reader then makes with the author, who was the one who had the idea in the first place, right? So you have all these relational things going on in this area of creative power. And I thought that was a really interesting way to break down the whole process, because this is the way Dorothy Sayers put it. What is conceived in the imagination must be brought into being and made manifest. And Madeline L'Engle wrote the foreword to that book, and she said, that's the tangible realizing of the work, making it real. Well, that's exactly what you guys are doing with software. You have the idea, you conceive the idea, and then the energy is the process of realizing that idea, instantiating it into a substance or a reality. And then the power would be in the way that it can be used by people after it's been created. So you have these three segments of what happens in every artistic creation.
And so, I mean, that's like, I mean, that sounds to me like, yeah, the word becomes flesh, right? Like Peugeot's like heaven and earth coming together, and that's where meaning is, right?
Well,
Christ
so
as,
what sprang in my mind was the way, the truth, and the life, because the way is the idea. It's the aspect of goodness. How what are we striving towards? What's the ultimate goal? That's the idea. And then the truth is Christ, right? The incarnation of Christ, the embodiment,
Mhm.
the energy, and then the power is the life of the body, the unity of the body, everybody working together, all the interactions. Um, so yeah, and I like your thought there too about Jonathan Peugeot and the union of heaven and earth.
Yeah, well, and what's funny is, I love Mathieu's book, The Language of Creation. He's
Mm-hmm,
also a software guy, so
mm-hmm,
I think my brain works similar to him in that, he's always talking about, yeah, one of his fundamental patterns is the heaven and the earth coming together, and that's meaning happens in that union of heaven and earth, right? Just as Christ is the union of his two natures, right?
mm-hmm.
And that, and in some sense, this is where all of it comes together, like, I mean, it comes together in Christ, and it is all, it's all patterned after him. It's patterned after his nature of this union, right? And so I actually think about this often during my workday, because it does feel like, yeah, we're taking the ideas, our conception of the system, and we're taking the raw code and, the language and all the stuff we do, and we're bringing it together, and that is the system. That's where the system emerges from. It
Mm-hmm.
emerges from heaven, coming down and meeting with earth. right? And I'm sure that's how art feels as well. I'm not an
Mhm.
artist, but it's the same
Well,
pattern, right?
yeah, it is, because with art, you have the idea, but then you have to be using things of the earth. You have to be using paint and brushes and paper or canvas, all of those tools of the earth that you're using. And the two of those together, the idea and then the tools, then you end up with this piece of art that is neither of those things. It's not just the idea, and it's an instantiated idea, but that idea required the things of earth to produce it. But there's an additional element in there, and that's the action, right? Um, this is one of the things that I think is so important. I think it was Carl Friston said that, or maybe it was Mark Solms, in the absence of precision, there cannot be adequate prediction. I don't have the quote right at hand, but the idea is that what I got from that is that the only way we can develop precision is through experience. So I cannot become a better artist just by having ideas, or just by watching videos of other people painting, or just by thinking about painting. The only way I can get better at painting is if I pick up the things of earth, the tools, the paint, the canvas, and I make an attempt. And there'll be many failed attempts, and each of those failed attempts, I learn something new. And that it's in that action where the development happens. So you must have some of that when you're developing software as well. You're writing code and oops, that wasn't right. I have to back up a little bit and do
Mm-hmm.
this. So you have this process, but that's how you hone your skills, and that's how you develop better and better product, and that's how you're able to kind of move up into higher realms and do more complicated things. And in the big picture, it's probably similar to, we're always talking about how we stand on the shoulders of giants, but all those people before us that laid the groundwork for those millions and millions of lines of code, they also made their errors, but that's how they got good enough to be able to do what they did, so that you have this support system underneath what you're doing now.
Yeah. Well, and even the tools themselves are structured that way. Like, um, modern websites are getting more and more complicated because you have kind of the original languages, like let's say, JavaScript, and then another language gets layered on top of that, and then something gets layered on top of that. And I mean that has like, it's gotten kind of crazy. It's gotten unmanageable. It's become very brittle actually because of this. Because now I'm working with a language that really gets translated down to this, down to this, down to this, down to this. And it used to be that 20 years ago, I just had to know the one down here. But now all the tools are becoming, it's almost, it's this weird like Tower of Babel sort of thing.
Hmm.
And
Is there a chance for error to happen through that translation process?
oh yeah. And we find, and so this is another whole conversation in the industry. There's a funny little anecdote I like where it used to be that especially before the internet, people would write a lot of their own stuff. And so everyone was kind of reinventing the wheel. There were lots of copies of the same kinds of whatever algorithms and stuff. But as people have started sharing more code, there's more, people will reuse code. And that lets you speed up quite a bit, right? Because now I'm not having to come up with ways to do all this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
You know, um, I can just go find a thing that already does it and it's free, and I just kind of plug it all together and it works, right? But that comes at a cost, right? Because the cost is that I don't understand those things because I'm really just treating it as a black box thing. And if it breaks, I might look inside and see what's going on. But like, someone's been working on that thing for years and they know all the nitty gritty fundamentals of it, and I don't. And I'm stringing together a whole bunch of these things to make my system work, right? And it just becomes very fragile, and you're just kind of cobbling stuff together for the sake of being very efficient and going fast. And so there's this funny thing that happened maybe a few years ago where like there's millions of programs that rely on this very trivial piece of shared code, which just takes a word and adds some spaces to the beginning of it on websites. I mean, it's very simple, you know. That's about the easiest possible thing you could do, and yet people have outsourced all of their stuff to things like this, right? Well, someone got mad, and it was like some sort of like political situation where someone decided to take that thing offline. Well, suddenly everything everywhere was broken because this, you know, this one trivial little thing was missing, but everyone was depending on it. And you know, all these websites were down and they couldn't build properly, and it was a mess, probably only for a few hours, you know, and it was easy to fix, but it started a conversation in the industry about like, why are we doing this? Why have we structured things this way? You know?
Well, so could I clarify that little piece? Was that, I'm so stupid. I don't really know how this
No,
works.
no, 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 no. It's I'm
But
not explaining
what
it well.
was it actually? It's online, and was it that actually integrated into other programs so that when they took it offline, it took it out of the program, or was it
Mhm.
just that? Oh my goodness! So it wasn't just
Yeah.
that new development had to start from scratch and not use that, but it actually. Are there other things like that? Could somebody take off some bigger, more important chunk and
Oh, there's all kinds of stuff like that,
oh
and it's
man,
getting worse and
that's
worse
worse than
every
the
day.
electric grid then, isn't it? That's
Oh
really
yeah, it's
scary.
it's very brittle. And but you know, we're all just used to it, and everyone's come to expect this, right? Like you want your whatever, your iPhone to work well and all these apps to work, and um you know, it's like we've learned to just accept this state of things for the sake of convenience. You know, I mean, this is kind of a dumb example maybe, but like yesterday I was on my little budgeting app and the connection to the bank wasn't working properly. Well, it used to be I didn't have that connection to the bank. I would just manually put in all my stuff. But I've gotten so used to not having to do that now that when the connection breaks for whatever reason, because of things like I'm describing, you know, all kinds of stuff, you've got two systems that have to stay in sync. But really, it's like the budgeting app talking to a whole bunch of different possible banks, right? And so any of those connections could break, right? And so it's like the more things become connected, the more brittle the whole world becomes, right? And this is, I mean, you know, there's ways sort of to have redundancies and stuff, but it's like there's this sort of weird inverse relationship between like the more I want things to be fast and efficient and convenient, the quicker it's going to fall apart. You know, the taller my building gets, the more it's going to sway in an earthquake. You know, and it's like I really think, I mean, my sense is that the industry is going to hit a tipping point soon. Well, you see this also with all the cloud stuff, right? You know, it's become very trendy to move all systems to the cloud, which is just, you know, other people's computers, you know. So it's like we take all our stuff and we put it on Amazon machines or Microsoft machines or whatever, but you know, when a hurricane hits Houston and their power grid goes offline, well, suddenly the whole world is, you know, depending on web traffic going through that Houston thing because of whatever. We're all relying on that system for something simple, kind of like the thing I was talking about earlier, but a little
Mhm.
more complicated, you know. Well, it's like, I mean, this actually happened to us. Like the Houston, whatever, their big farm out there went down for a day or something or a few hours, and like suddenly our whole system was down because all of our traffic was going through that one location, right? And that was a decision we made for convenience because that allowed us to not have to deal with all these other issues, you know, architecturally. Because of that one architectural decision, it, you know, it became this single point of failure, right? And they advertise it as like, oh, well, you know, there's all these redundancies, and if that goes down, it'll go through here. And it's like, yeah, okay, hopefully, ideally that would work, but it's not always going to. And so I think as you know, if the industry continues moving this direction, we're all going to start dumping our stuff on Amazon and Microsoft and depending on these single points of failure for convenience. And when those go down, oh well, tough, you know. And I mean, I'm not all
I guess I'm
super
more
doomsday
concerned
about
about
it.
this Tower of Turtles where there have been all these different languages through the decades that things have been built on, and without going in and starting from scratch on any of it, it's just it's just all cobbled together from the bottom up. And then if you know, they talk that that's the way the electrical grid is too. Everything is just cobbled together. So in order to redo the electric grid would be a massive, unimaginable project. And I'm assuming that
Mhm.
the internet is the same way, like,
Yeah.
and all the
Well,
software and everything.
I think one benefit of I think one benefit the software industry has over others is that like it is easier to change things. It is a lot quicker to change things. And so, like in our system, I started this company 7 years ago, and 7 years ago the whole system looked completely different. I mean, it's really like a ship of Theseus situation where we've kind of replaced parts slowly, one by one, according to whatever our system of values is. And so we sit down and decide, okay, this is the biggest pain point for us, so let's redo this, and then let's redo this, and then let's redo this. And it's like, fast forward 7 years, the whole system sort of is very, very different. And a lot of those fragile, brittle things, we've found ways to clean them up and make them more robust, right? But
Mhm.
we're still relying on this kind of fragile uh architecture, fragile like software world. But maybe, I don't know, maybe that also can be addressed. I think like as and I think that will happen naturally. So like I was talking about with JavaScript having all these things on top of it, eventually everyone's going to get sick of it and they're going to move on to, some other things that are emerging that are like similar technologies, but they're sort of newer and they're going to be more robust. And it'll be this kind of eternal recurrence of the same thing, I think. And
Well,
so
is
like
there
I'm
any
not
way
like
that, like, I don't know, this is probably a dumb idea, and yeah, anyway, is there any
sure.
way that AI, maybe not as currently constituted, but at some future point, you could just give a program to AI and say, okay, this has a whole bunch of different languages in it. We'd like you to translate the whole thing from the bottom up into X language, and
Yeah,
then,
well, so it's really interesting you bring that up because that's like not that exact thing, but that type of thing has actually been my job for the past 3 years. Like basically, we have this massive system that was in on a bunch of old technologies, and it would have been too slow for us to manually redo all of it. And so we chose, for the sake of simplicity and speed, to do a couple things. One, we started adding layers on top to make it work with modern tools. And so we kind of kept all the old stuff, inserted these very complicated middle layers, and then the modern version of it kind of rests on top, right? And so that let us move fast, but it is at the cost of it being a little more complicated, right? But also what I've been doing is a lot of writing little robots almost that like look at the old code, try to understand it in a very rudimentary sense, and then generate new code that works with this new structure,
oh,
right?
beautiful. Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
That's what I was thinking.
And
That's exactly
yeah,
what.
yeah. And it's like, that process for me has been very manual. I'm having to tell it, okay, here's what our old patterns looked like. Go find all of those. And it'll go find, 10,000 instances of that pattern. And then I'll tell it, okay, in these types of situations, generate this, and in these types of situations, generate this. And it's very complicated, but it worked. We were able to do this successfully. And probably I think AI will somehow, in some manner, start to automate things like that.
Mhm.
Already, I mean, the GPT, the chat GPT thing that everyone's talking about, it can already spit out code for you. It's not very good at it necessarily, but it has a lot of knowledge. And so it's almost like asking you know, the Oracle of Delphi, like, hey, how would I start doing XYZ? And it'll actually give you a decent response and say, look, well, in that technology, here's kind of the parts of it, and here's how they would sort of fit together. And it's a little bit wrong, but it is actually a lot faster than doing a Google search for all the different things I need, because I don't know all the paths I need to trace to figure out the new thing. But like the AI already in its current state can do parts of that for me.
Hmm.
And I find that very interesting, and I'm sure that's only going to improve over time. But I don't know a lot about AI and its limitations and stuff, so I'm, like I don't know what the implications of it are going to be, but there are a lot of people in the industry that are pretty excited about the prospect of what that'll mean. But it's the same as the conversation about AI art. Like, what are the consequences of this for our experience as human beings? Like, I don't know. I'm not very optimistic about that, you know?
The thing I notice about most of the AI art is it all has a certain look to it. It's not really idiosyncratic. Even when the thing pumps out a bunch of different, there are scientists who are giving it prompts to pump out some sort of an artistic vision of some scientific concept. And so it'll pump out four variations on every concept. But they all have a certain look to them. You can tell that that's this the AI has a style,
Right.
right? And so not everybody goes for that style. Some of them are
Hmm.
incredibly beautiful and very detailed, and some of them are beautifully composed. I mean, you can see that the thing has had some sort of input on what makes good composition and good balance and all of that. So I mean that's
Hmm.
all amazing. But it's also, I guess, what I'd call a little bit shiny or a little bit pretty. It doesn't have that error in there that makes things look human, artistic kind of.
Hmm.
Doesn't have those little error signals.
Right. And then when it does, they're atrocious. It's like hands that are not
Yes,
hands, and
yeah,
they're like
yeah,
demonic. Yeah.
yeah. Or the face is missing, or the head is turned backwards, or something like that. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. But not
And
the kind of little errors that make things beautiful. I mean, like they say that Michelangelo, when he would complete a piece, he would go back in and chip off a piece because he never wanted anything to be
hmm.
perfect. Because I don't know if this was his reasoning. Maybe he was thinking only God is perfect, and maybe he was kind of arrogant to think that he had produced something perfect that needed to have a chip taken out of it. I don't know, but that was
Right.
his thinking. That there is a certain thing that makes something look human made, and I don't think we want to lose that, because that's part of what keeps the liveliness. That's part of what always gives something more to strive for. If you ever attain perfection or think that you've attained perfection, you stop moving upward, you stop trying, right?
Hmm.
So you have this, you're talking about this kind of um what did you call it? A Tower of Babel of there's two sides to that. There's the Tower of Babel that makes things brittle and there's too many pieces and all of that. But inside that Tower of Babel with your software, there's also all these shoulders of giants and this amazing technology that you've built on top, and it's all progressing upwards towards something better. But
Hmm.
if you hit the top and okay, we've arrived, then you're not going to bother anymore. That's the end of the software development. But because we can never reach the top, because true goodness and truth and beauty are so unimaginably far beyond anything we could ever conceive, then we always have room to grow, always have room to grow. That comes out of our imperfection. So if you didn't have the imperfection, there'd be no place to go.
Hmm.
I
Yeah.
broke the internet.
They're good. My mind's in like a million different places. I yeah, I don't know. I mean, just on a personal note, I'm just kind of like, I am a little nervous about the future of my industry. Like, it really feels weird right now. And I don't know how much of that is just me or my job or whatever, but it's like, I don't know. And it's the same feeling I have about AI art and AI everything, and just like the political landscape. And it's just like, we're in this weird time, and it feels like it's manifesting in like every area of life in a way. And I think the feeling I get when I listen to, again, going back to like the Logos at Ephesus, is that like a lot of it really does have to do with this conversation about like fundamentally what are we and what is consciousness and what is our value as humans in relation to the technical world or the world of matter. What is our place now, and I don't know.
Well, real interesting article I read a few weeks ago about what this one guy, he wrote the article for Medium. And I don't know, I tried to cut and paste from it so that I could post some things from it, but it wouldn't let me. It was acting like a PDF or something.
Interesting.
So I can't even remember the guy's name, but I'd like to give him some attribution, but I can't remember his name, and he wouldn't let me cut and paste. So, but he said that he felt the major weakness of AI is that, which he thinks will always be a weakness of AI, is the inability to generalize. Which I think by that he means like the difficulty of categorizing, because human beings have a unique ability to categorize in spite of the combinatorial explosion of trying to understand why we categorize things in certain ways. I don't know if you've ever heard John Vervaeke riff on this, but you could take a plum and a lawnmower and say, is there a category that you can put these two in?
Right.
Well, he said, actually, there's an infinite number of ways that a plum and a lawnmower are similar. So
Right.
yes, you could find a lot of categories to put a plum and a lawnmower into, but an AI would probably never happen across that because the space is infinite. The AI would begin the search the whole space looking. But an American, a human being has just an ability to zone right in on the relevant issue.
Right.
And that's that's the mystery of relevance realization.
Well, and so then I think like, going back to my conversation about like my coworkers tend to be like the devil's advocate inside my head, that I like have these imaginary conversations when I'm wrestling through this stuff, because I think they would say like, well, yes, the recursive relevance realization is a complex process, but it still is, just a material process that someday maybe we will be able to harness, and then the AI will be able to do the same thing that we do. I'm not convinced that's true. I think a lot of even the materialists are not convinced that's true, um, or not convinced that it's attainable. And I guess, going back to my question about like how do you, I don't have a response to that, to be honest. It's like
Mhm.
my gut is that I don't know. I mean,
You're
this is
concerned
kind of the
about
crux of things for
the
me.
God of the gaps argument.
I guess so. Yeah. Yeah. I think that's all I'm really saying
Yeah.
is
So
it
so
yeah, go
what
ahead.
does it matter in the long run if I mean if every single gap is filled, that's irrelevant because it's not God is not just the God of the gaps. I think it's C.S. Lewis that said God is the God of the whole show. I mean, before time began, God is. Before time began, God is. And so in some sense, and I don't mean this in a pantheistic way, but in some sense, the whole universe resides in God, or whether it's in God's mind or in, whatever God is,
Right.
God is unimaginable to us. So he manifests himself in three persons so that we have a way to come, have some sort of grasp, have some way of having a relationship with God. So he manifests himself as three co-equal persons, but God is is beyond our imagination. So if the scientists are able to answer every question, so what? I mean, they only have questions because the world exists. They only have questions because the cosmos is here. If the cosmos wasn't here, and if it didn't, I mean, I always go back to that old canard of I think it was Stephen Hawking's who said, "Just give me gravity, and I can give you a universe." Well,
Mhm.
okay, but you still need gravity.
Yeah.
Um, the physical laws still need to be there. So, going back to this idea idea, the creative energy, and the creative power, I wonder if you tried to parse that out into a chart, which I know has its own dangers, that the physical laws would be the creative idea, and then the energy would be the matter and energy that make up the universe at the Big Bang, and then the creative power is actually what, as believers, we would call the book of works. There's the book of the word, but there's also the book of works, so that when we look at the creation, when we look at the cosmos, we look at the stars and the heavens and trees and insects and multicellular organisms. That is the power of our relationship with. It's like reading the book of God's handiwork and being able to see His glory and His beauty manifest. So, but the physical laws are a very important part of that. So there's no problem whatever with scientists exploring those physical laws, just in the way that there's no problem whatever with an artist exploring their idea and trying to find a way to bring it into instantiation in the world using material um, tools and so forth, or a software developer having an idea and then using bits and bytes and electrons and all the things that you guys use to instantiate that pattern into the world in a way that works, so that in the power comes in the interaction between the software and the user. And in some little way, although I think it's too far now, but there should be a way in as we interact with that software that we have great gratitude towards the software developers that spend all those hours. Because, software developers give their whole lives to this stuff. It's not like you work 9 to 5 and go home and just enjoy life. It's in your head all the time, I'm guessing.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and thankfully I've gotten decently good at turning it off. But yeah, and I've been doing it for so long. I mean, like I said, I've been doing it since I was like 7. So it's just like it's the way I think about the world in terms of these patterns, and it's like unavoidable at this point. I dream about code,
Mm-hmm.
and that's just what it is. But I enjoy it because it does, yeah, it does feel like it is my Peterson talks in that video about us kind of I can't remember how he phrases it, but sort of us embodying the logos,
Mm-hmm.
in the same way that we are kind of bringing heaven and earth together through our, we are mediators in a sense, between the world and the ideas and whatever. Like I feel that when I'm doing my work, and I love it. It's a good feeling. I think I don't know. I think we're designed for that. Um,
When you were 7, what was the first thing that you wrote?
I really liked SpongeBob, and
Uh-huh.
so I made a little website that was dedicated to SpongeBob. I'm sure it was really dumb, but I can't find it anymore.
Oh, I was going to say, so it's not out there anymore, huh?
No, yeah. I mean, it might be. It was on this old hosting service called Angel Fire. But actually, I still remember the day when uh I don't know how to put it, like discovered abstraction, if that makes any sense. Like back then I would just kind of read people's code and just kind of like copy paste stuff and didn't really understand what I was doing. And then when I tried to really start thinking about it myself, I would just kind of duplicate stuff all the time. So like I remember I was working on this little, I don't know, like a little web page that would show a slideshow of images, and I wanted it to move and all this kind of stuff. And so I had a little piece of code that was like show image 1, and then a piece of code that was show image 2, and then a piece of code that was show image 3. And I had like 20 of those or whatever. And when I wanted to add new images, I would have to add new code, which is like a terrible way to do it, but I didn't know any better. And then one day I discovered, oh, wait, I can just have one of those, and I can pass in a variable and it'll do the thing based on that variable. I seriously care, and I still remember the moment when that clicked with me, because it was like the world opened up to me, because I suddenly understood, like, oh, all of this will just be that process just built on top of itself forever, you know. And that's what it is. It's like, I make a thing that can take a little bit of input and give some output, and then I put those together to build something more complex, and that process just continues up to build the most complex things, and then you can do it the opposite way too. You can think, okay, trying to conceptualize like a whole system, like Zoom. Well, there's so much going on here, but you can break it into parts, and when you get down to the bottom, it's like, oh, okay, I can manage that. I can manage each of these little pieces, and then I can put it together to form a system. And um yeah, so it's a fun process. And I imagine it's the same sort of enjoyment people get out of their other fields and endeavors, like art.
Well, I've
um
always found it fascinating that in a company that has, like 1,000 software designers or something like that, you have probably more than one, but you have at least some architects whose job it is to see this whole big picture and then go around and hand out all the little jobs to everybody, right?
mhm.
How on earth, can one person have a grasp of that and not only have a grasp of the big picture, but figure out a way to break it down into pieces that will actually fit together, and pieces that are suited to each person who's getting the task of doing that, because I'm sure that there's different kinds of designers, right? Different kinds of developers.
Mhm.
So some are more suited to other tasks, and so you do have to be a people person. You have to have a grasp of abstraction. I suppose that that's what that Jim Keller does. That guy, Jordan Peterson's brother-in-law, that's this fairly well-known software developer.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not familiar with him, actually. I'll have to look him up.
Oh, he has a really interesting interview with Lex Friedman.
Okay.
That would be the place to start, I think. Jordan Peterson
Okay.
did an interview with him, but that wasn't very satisfactory, I didn't think,
Okay.
because Jim Keller wasn't at his best there. But talking to Lex Friedman, he was really very interesting.
Okay.
I mean, he's been around in the industry for a long time, so some of what he worked on that made him famous is no longer like cutting edge kind of stuff, but he's still working
Right.
in the industry.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah, I'll have to look into that. But yeah, what you're saying about like yeah, the architect and the top down stuff and everything, like it's that is another thing that I find interesting about the industry, because the attitude toward that sort of thing has changed over time. Where the industry used to be big on this process called waterfall. So like the image of like top down flowing, where like you have people up at the top deciding the architecture, and they decide the pieces, and it goes down, right? But I think what the industry found was that the feedback loop on that was so slow, because you wouldn't find problems until you got to the very bottom, and that was many
Mhm.
layers down, right? And then hopefully that would feed back up to the top, and then you'd start the process over again. And that was just so slow, because each of these iterations is like months or whatever. um and so what started happening is this sort of I don't know, this sort of dance between top down and bottom up, a sort of like trying to make it more organic and trying to shorten the feedback loop. And I mean, there's a lot of debate on how well that does or doesn't work or whatever. But it is interesting, because like in the system I work on, like we do have that architect who has it all in his head. Um, but he can't be involved with everything, and especially as the system grows and becomes more complex, that has just become not sustainable, right? And so even as an organization right now, we're kind of in the process of trying to figure out, like, what does that shift look like. Because in the past it was pretty reasonable for him to know everything and kind of make a lot of decisions, but like that's just not the way it can work anymore. So now what? And it's like, I was thinking earlier today, are you familiar with like Pajot talking about like a city having a body, that sort of thing? It's like it feels in a way that like our system has a mind, and the mind is all the developers as
Sure,
neurons,
like a distributed cognition. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's like it is funny because yeah, we've all loaded this mental model of the system in our heads, and we're all kind of interacting with each other, and we'll sit in meetings where the whole purpose of the meeting is to kind of recalibrate everyone's mental models, right? Um, and I don't know why this just popped in my head, but I was listening to Vervaeke the other day talk about depression and how, um, depression is kind of a state where you are trying to recalibrate in a way, because whatever you're trying to do to grip the world, to move into the world, to move towards possibility is just not working for you. And so you stop, you slow down, movement becomes small so that you can try to, recalibrate and then go back into movement. Um,
I never thought about that before. That's really fascinating.
yeah, I'll send you the link to the video.
Yeah, that would be
It's
great. And I was also wanting to tell you about, there's a video by Cesar Hidalgo. Are you familiar with him? Um, I'll send you the video. I'll put it in the description below this
okay.
video. But he also has a wonderful book that you might enjoy a lot called How Information Grows. And
Okay.
he's looking at exactly that problem that you're talking about, how not only when a group of like developers are working together in a company, but then how all different companies have to be interacting with each other, because you're working with your vendors and your suppliers and your
Yeah.
buyers and all of that kind of stuff. And so all of that is what brings about the growth of, I mean, everything, civilization, the growth of information, makes
Yeah.
things possible. He uses a beautiful illustration of like how Chile has vast amounts of copper. And so you would think that Chile would be a very rich nation because they have all this copper, but they don't have information. So the
Mm.
nations that have information are the ones that are rich, not the ones that have the natural resources today. I mean, that's just the way it
Right.
works, right? Um,
Interesting.
and the illustration that he used was, okay, you could take a Lamborghini and maybe it cost $250,000 when you drove it off the lot. But if you wrap it around a tree on the way home, and now it's all just pieces, it
Hmm.
has zero value. So, because the value was in the information, in the way the pieces
Mm.
fit together. And isn't that just the way the world works too? You can know all about the elementary particles, but they don't have any meaning or value until they fit together into
Mm.
something. And I don't think the scientists have yet figured out how those
Mhm.
elementary particles fit together and become something,
Right.
because there's a lot of layers there. And maybe it is a God of the gaps thing. Okay, fine. But information is somehow at the, well, I don't think information is fundamental, but I think communication somehow is fundamental. Language or the word or communication somehow is fundamental. And information is a subset of communication, because information by itself is meaningless unless you have a sender and a receiver.
Mm.
So there's no meaning in the information
And
itself.
a shared understanding of how it's structured, right?
Yes.
Like
Yeah.
like we, it's funny, like people will kind of jokingly ask me like, what am I saying in binary? And they'll just say zero, whatever. They're trying to be funny. But really it's like it's a nonsense question, because you just saying zeros and ones is nothing unless there is some higher level understanding of like, okay, 0110 means A
Mm-hmm.
and 0111 means B or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
it's like without that map, without that higher level meaning, the string of stuff is just nonsense,
Mm-hmm.
and I think this is one of those things that like you learn it in school as a developer, and it kind of takes a minute to wrap your brain around, you know. Um, but once you do, a lot of stuff starts to click into place. Or similar to what we were talking about earlier, where like there has to be some higher level deciding the way things work. How Wi-Fi should work, how 5G should work in order for any of this stuff to get built, right? Without that, it's not going to happen. I
Well,
forgot
yeah,
where I
the
was going
thing
with
that is
that.
interesting about that is sometimes it's just one person,
Mm-hmm.
you know. I remember years ago, my husband used to work for Qualcomm, and he explained to me one time how Qualcomm came to be because the founder of Qualcomm had found kind of a new way inside his head of tweaking something that turns out to be very important in the whole internet thing. I don't remember what it was, but he found a new way, and then that became the protocol for everybody. And so now that thing is everywhere. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, that they had some kind of patent on it. So Qualcomm could get a lot of money even without doing any work by just getting the royalties from the patents on that from everybody else who's using it, because there's no other way to do it now. Because this one guy's idea, and maybe it wasn't even his idea, maybe he stole it from somebody. How do I know? But it was one person who had an idea, and then that idea gets instantiated, and then it gets played out through all these different levels. And wouldn't it be funny if that guy could just say, you know what, I don't want anybody to use my idea anymore, and just suck it out of everybody's brains?
Yeah. Well, so what's interesting about that exact thing is that that has sort of happened. Not sucking out of people's brains, obviously, but
Yeah.
like, the guy who made Linux. Um, I don't even remember the context of what happened exactly, but there was some debate, some political debate, and there was some question about like, okay, if he just decided one day to change the license of Linux and say no one can use this anymore, legally, technically, he could do that, and then the implications of that could be enormous. And that would get filtered through courts and probably shot down or whatever. But like, it is interesting because yeah, so much stuff has been built on top of the thing he created, and then it's like, okay, what does it mean exactly that he has ownership of that or a patent on that or whatever, however it works, like the licensing around software is really complicated or politically complicated because what exactly does it mean to copyright? Yeah, are we copywriting an instantiation of the thing? Are we copywriting the idea? What layer of abstraction have we copyrighted? That's actually a real issue. This is
Mm-hmm.
why you see things like Google getting in lawsuits over using some other thing and whatever, and it's like, how much do you have to change before it's technically different? I don't know. What is different? What does that mean? What exactly does it mean to have a copyright over something that is is a mental model that lives in people's heads?
Well, and it's a mental model that lives in people's heads, and it's being used for in many different arenas for many different things. So even if the mental model itself could be patentable, the way that it's been instantiated and used by other people and communicated in all these other instantiations is unique, and maybe doesn't even carry the same stamp anymore of the original thing. So yeah, that's pretty crazy. But I'm thinking about, like, the Linux thing is just a larger version of what happens all the time, because there are a lot of these smaller apps and um, websites and everything where they say, oh, this is free. You can use this for free. It's never going to cost you anything. And then 2 years down the road, they start, well, actually, we need $8 a month. It's not
Mm-hmm.
free anymore. So,
Yeah.
that happens all the time. And so it could easily happen that Linux would just say, you know what, you can't use this anymore, or it's going to cost money now, or if it was one of these evil geniuses, he could hold the whole country, the whole world hostage to his thing. Pretty interesting.
Right.
I guess that's why they say Tanstaffel, right? There ain't no such thing as a free lunch. So if when you think there
Yeah.
is and you make use of the freeness of it, it might come back to bite you at some point.
Hmm. Yeah. And I mean the free and open source software thing is like, yeah, it's a whole can of worms for these kinds of reasons and also other reasons. Like, there's this thing that millions of people use that uh, I don't even know how to describe. It's called Newton Soft. I mean, there's lots of things like this, but like, it's basically maintained by one guy, and it's a pretty simple thing what it's doing, but you know, tons of people are relying on it, and so there's tons of people that are making demands of him on this public forum saying you should change it to this, and you should, and arguing and all kinds of stuff. And it's like theoretically anyone could help contribute to this, but like realistically, he's the one that's probably going to do most of it because he's the one who's done all the work to get the mental model in his head properly, and he's kind of the gatekeeper over it. So if I suggest a change and give it to him, he can just say, I don't want that, or I think you did it badly, or whatever. And so it's like even Microsoft now is open sourcing a lot of their stuff, which is really interesting because you can see in some of their newer tools, I'll be using it for work and I'll run into some weird issue and I'm like, what's going on there? And then I Google it and I find some forum thread where hundreds of people are arguing about this. And sometimes it's a very trivial thing. It's like a one line change, but everyone's arguing like, well, it should be done this way or that way. And now that it's open for everyone to see, it's all messy. And then eventually you get someone from Microsoft saying, well, we're not going to do it because of this. And then everyone rages at them. And, it's like, I don't know. It's kind of wacky. It's just the cost of everything being visible.
Well, maybe that is because we focus too much on the accuracy aspect of it. I like the phrase that you used earlier when you were talking about the dance,
Hmm.
because I think there is an aspect of all these things that has to be a dance, and it has to be the proper proportion for the moment and for this time and for this place and for this group of people, the proper proportion balance between accuracy and expression.
Mm.
And if you get too much down in the weeds with all these people demanding this and that and niggling on this little thing, then the whole thing's going to break. But if you don't have some sort of standards, the whole thing is going to break as well. So there has to be some sort of a dance between those two things. And the picture comes into my mind. Have you ever watched or have you ever done square dancing?
A little bit.
My husband
Yeah.
and I joined a square dance club for a few years, about, I don't know, 7 or 8 years ago, maybe.
Okay.
And one of the first things we noticed was it's a place that builds community unbelievably well because you're holding hands with everybody all night long. People that
That's
you'd never
funny.
hold hands with anywhere else.
Huh.
And you're holding hands with people of your own sex and people of the opposite sex and people of intersex and all kinds of people you're holding hands with, and you're doing this all night long. And but you also are learning all these intricate calls, because the kind of stuff they teach in grade school is so elementary. Our caller taught us 139 calls, and with those 139 calls he could sing his way through any, thousands of songs, and call out the calls to those things and do all these intricate dances. And so the caller is up there calling the call, and the dancers are just responding call by call to these little things.
Hmm.
But because the whole thing is working together, it turns into this very intricate design. And yet there's a
Interesting.
lot of freedom in the design. You don't at all feel like you're being forced to obey a lot of rules. You feel like you're involved in a dance, and it's a community kind of
Hmm.
thing, and there's a real beauty to it. So
And
it's
it
not
only
like that.
works as long as everyone is submitting themselves to the rules of each
Yes,
call, right?
yes, yeah, yeah. Or somebody just if somebody's face is off for a second, which I would do sometimes and miss a call, it's like, what am I supposed to do? You end up flying out of the circle or something like that, you know?
Mm.
So, yeah, it's a very interesting process. I really enjoyed it, but that's also why I ended up having to have my left hip replaced because for whatever reason, the woman always spins on her left leg. They do all these twirls. The women are the only one that do the twirls,
Yeah.
and the twirl is always on the left leg. So when I went in to get my hip replacement, the surgeon said, "Well, what have you been doing?" And I said, "Well, the only thing that I can really think of that might have had something to do with this," he said, I said, "is square dancing." And he said, "Oh, you wouldn't believe how many left hip replacements I do for square dance."
Really?
Yeah. So there's
Huh.
you have to be, you know, maybe more athletic or in better shape so that your muscles know how to react to that kind of thing. Um, but that's probably why I probably won't be doing square dancing again. But it was a great experience, and you do meet a lot of people and people who are very passionate about it. And strangely enough, the group we were in had members who had been members for like 40 years
Really?
to the same club, and they met their spouse at the club. And so when the club first started, there were like 500 members. And so of course there were a lot of single men and women, and they were all young when they started. Now they're all old because the young people aren't coming along and getting into square dancing. But it was a terrific place to meet mates, and it's a very wholesome activity. So uh, there's a lot to be said for it. There are a couple of square dance clubs in the area that are like more like college age and young adults that are involved in it, but they're kind
Yeah.
of small compared to what they used to be. There used to be square dance clubs with 500,000 people all over the United States. And
Man.
then once you learn a certain kind of calling, you can go to any community and enter in. There are different kinds of calling, just like there are different sports. And so if you
Right.
don't know the calling to a particular regional kind of calling, you can't really function in a square dance group. But they've kind of made a protocol set of calling so that you can go pretty much anywhere in the United States and dance the same square dance with people. So people travel
Interesting.
all over. They go to these competitions, and but then you have to wear these weird clothes with big puffy
Right.
sleeves and big puffy skirts. That was a part I could kind of never get into, but it was fun. But the holding hands was amazing. And of
Yeah.
course they had to shut it down during COVID.
Right.
That was the end of it for like 3 years, which made me feel really bad because a lot of those people, that's the only community they ever had
Yeah.
was being able to go and dance once a week with people.
Yeah. Did it rebound okay after the?
You know, I don't know because we stopped going probably 5 years ago, so I haven't kept in
Okay.
touch. Yeah, my
Mm.
husband's job just got too demanding because you have to be there at a certain time. I think it was like 6:30 or 7 o'clock at night, and George often works much later than that, and we just couldn't always get there. And
Mm.
so
Man.
it's demanding building Wi-Fi widgets.
Yeah. That's
Yeah.
understandable.
This
Man.
has been great, Ryan. I hope we can pick up again where we left off and maybe delve a little bit more into the art side of things. And I can talk about it from the art perspective, and then you can tell me if that fits in with what you're doing in software.
Yeah. That'd be cool. Appreciate it.
Great. I look forward to talking with you again.
Yeah. Thank you.
Time for you to go get
All right.
dinner because I think you're further east than I am. So
Yeah. Yeah. That's about, yeah. It's time. So,
have a great evening.
all right. You too. Take
Okay.
care.
Bye bye.